Okay. Thank you, everyone. So I'm Molly. I work with Friends of the Upper Delaware River, and I am here today with Steve Swenson and Caroline Schaefer and Tracy Brown. Steve is from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and Caroline and Tracy are from Trout Unlimited. And in past years, we have been able to essentially run through some really cool stream restoration work that's, happening and is, kind of the hot topic right now. But this year we were, again, a little bit delayed due to COVID. But we do have kind of a few bright lights still, shining through this dark, which tend to be very much focused around the research work that's going on in the basin that accompanies the on-the-ground work. So we are going to get a little bit into the weeds on that today, and hopefully you all find this really interesting as a support and a way that we make our on-the-ground projects stronger and better. So I'm going to hand it over to Tracy.
Hi, everyone. I am Tracy Brown, and I'm with Trout Unlimited. I'm the restoration manager for New York and Connecticut. And I work very closely, TU works very closely with New York State DEC and FUDR in the Delaware River Basin. And as Molly mentioned, we've had a challenging year getting some work done on the ground, but we have quite a bit of monitoring and restoration work going to support our projects. Our partnerships are key to getting all of our work done, from the research to the implementation. And without our funders, of course, none of this would happen. Go ahead, Molly. So the key, our topic of discussion today will really be focused on effectiveness monitoring for our restoration work and all the research that we have going on. We were able to continue with all of this work this summer, but many of the projects, as you'll see, are multi-year and have been going on for 4 or 5 years prior to this year. So this kind of added an extra year of data, but really the importance of monitoring for restoration for us is really understanding what the effectiveness of our actual work on the ground, and really how that really leads to identifying future work and methods and those kinds of things. And what we will be talking about specifically in this talk is how we're tracking and monitoring fish to identify issues with dams and water quality impacts, and how important tributaries are. Looking at temperature monitoring in different ways. We have different technologies that we're testing. And then, of course, our ongoing stream morphology and habitat work, and other monitoring efforts such as barrier assessments and road stream crossing assessments to kind of help us understand habitat fragmentation in the Upper Delaware and elsewhere where we work. So luckily we have Steve Swenson and Caroline, who really are our boots on the ground doing this research day in and day out, and they will take it from here. Go ahead, Steve. Steve, you might check you're not on mute.
Is Steve able to unmute himself? Does anyone know?
Here we go. How's that? Am I on now?
You're on.
We can hear you.
Sorry. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. The first project I'm going to talk about is the Tiffany Hollow Brook Culvert Replacement. This is in the town of Colchester. The town of Colchester Highway Super came to me several years ago, and he was very concerned this culvert was going to fail during the next storm event. It basically was squishing down. It wasn't structurally sound anymore. There were voids in the road and gaps between the culvert and the head wall. So I applied for a National Fish Passage Grant through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and was awarded $96,000 to put towards replacing this culvert. And so we installed a 3-sided structural plate arch, which will now pass a 100-year storm. It has reconnected 3.6 miles of high-quality spawning habitat. And the town put in about $30,000 on top of the $96,000 we had to do this. It's a trout spawning stream, so it's a very important stream. And essentially what we have at the bottom here is the new culvert. That's not a recent picture. I couldn't seem to find the most recent picture I had, but it kind of gives you the idea of now we have basically a natural stream bed moving through, and we don't have a fish barrier anymore. So next slide, please.
Oh, why isn't this going? There we go.
Okay, so another project that we finished recently is the East Branch Boulder Cluster project. So as I was driving up and down 30 throughout the years, I noticed there wasn't a lot of structure in the East Branch between Downsville and East Branch. And so we chose 3 sites on the East Branch to put in boulder clusters. And these boulder clusters, they create basically cover for fish and areas for the fish to feed. And so they're pretty good to put in large river systems like this. Essentially, we put in 12 boulder clusters at 3 different locations between Downsville and East Branch. In addition to that, 2 of the DOT sites that we put these boulder clusters at are fishing access sites, and we're just a mess. So we did have those sites cleaned up. We still have a little bit of work to do at the East Branch site. So a lot of trash was removed that had been historic and dumped over the bank, old culverts and metal, and so now it's you can walk down there without twisting your ankle. We still have to plant some trees, so we're not completely done, but I think overall the project went very well, and it cost us about $40,000 to do this. This was a DEC DOT partnership. Next slide, please. This is Fuller Hollow Brook, which is in the town of Colchester, and this culvert is slated for replacement hopefully in 2021, and FUDR and TU and a bunch of folks basically were awarded money to replace this culvert. And so I was asked to go in and do a pre-construction survey, which I do for every project that we work on, just so we have an idea of what's going on before and after construction. And I found something that is kind of concerning to me whenever I do this and we're already slated to replace the culvert. I found brook trout upstream of the culvert and brown and brook trout downstream of the culvert. So the question is, once we replace this culvert, what are the impacts going to be to the brook trout upstream of the culvert? And so we're on our 2nd year of monitoring, pre-construction monitoring, and we decided to put in a radio frequency identification unit, which Caroline's going to get into a little bit more later in the slideshow. But essentially what it does is we tag fish, and as the fish move up through the RFID, it picks up a number. It's kind of like when you tag your dog with a little tag in its back. We do the same thing to fish. And so we put it upstream of the culvert. I seriously doubt we're going to get any passage through that culvert. It's quite a barrier, but we did it anyway. We put in 3 thermographs upstream and downstream of the culvert to monitor the temperature. And so, again, what we want to do is once we replace this culvert, we want to learn from this and, really try to figure out if there were any substantial impacts to the brook trout population upstream. So we're going to use this as a learning experience as well as, a restoration project. Next slide, please. This is a project on Cook Brook. This is a tributary to the Beaver Kill down in Colchester again, in Cooks Falls. I've been working on this project for 3 years or so. Caroline's been working with me for the past 2 years on it. And so the middle picture is the culvert that we're going to be looking at here. It's an existing culvert, and it does create a fish barrier during certain flows. And so typically when you talk fish barrier, you always want to talk flows. And so I realize the graphs are kind of hard to see on the right-hand side of the screen, but the take-home message is the lines indicate, the green and red lines indicate when fish can pass under which flows during 2018 and 2019 years. And they can pass between 0.55 feet per second and 3.4 feet per second. We actually passed 100 millimeter fish up this culvert during flows that are in that middle slide, which is 0.55 feet per second. So a fairly small fish can still pass up through that culvert, which is fairly remarkable, I think. And so it all does depend on the flows. It depends on how the culvert is constructed. Are there any voids in the culvert where the fish can get up through, like on the left-hand side of this culvert? The other thing we did is we tested homemade radio frequency identification units that I built here for $270 a piece versus ones that you purchase from Oregon RFID for about $2,000 a piece. And they did fairly well. They're a lot more fussy, and they require a lot more maintenance. So they're, you know, you get what you pay for. The last thing I want to talk about on this slide is on the left side of the slide, you can actually see where we installed the baffles this year. Thanks to our TU technicians that are working with FUDR and Caroline, they put in the elbow grease and put these in the culvert. And these baffles are made by ATS Environmental out of New Zealand, and I'm not aware of anywhere on the East Coast where they've been used yet. And so this is, to my knowledge, the first location. And if they work well, we'd like to put them in more locations, because they're fairly easy to put in, and they're fairly cheap compared to other baffle designs. So we're excited to see what the results are next year when we, and actually as well as this year, when we look at all the results and see how well the fish move through and what fish move through after we install the baffles. Next slide, please. These are just some photos of our team here. There's some DEC folks and some TU folks installing some baffles there on the left-hand side. And in the middle, you can see the baffles installed. They look nice. They're providing basically resting area within the culvert. They're slowing down velocities. These baffles will bend over during a flood. So if there's a lot of gravel accumulated behind them, they'll flush the gravel, and then they'll bend back up, and the gravel will regrade inside the culvert. So they don't decrease the hydraulic capacity of the culvert at all, which is something the town supervisors really like. Next slide, please. This is something that we've been working on with FUDR and TU for the past year or two. It took us a couple years to actually get this unit. They're very hard to get a hold of, I learned. They're very expensive. They're also very finicky to work with. It took quite a bit of time to learn how to use this. It's called a distributed temperature sensing system. And what it does is you can run up to 4 fiber optic cables on the optical switch that we have. And what that does is we can run 500-meter cables down the length of a stream. And what we're looking for is groundwater upwelling, which basically can provide thermal relief for fish. And hopefully in the future, what we can do once we find these groundwater upwellings is focus on those areas and install treatments in these locations so that fish have nice cold water coming up in and cover as well, not just cover, you know, thrown anywhere, cover thrown where, or put intentionally where there's cold water coming up from the ground. And so we've used this quite a bit this year, and the results are still coming in, and we're still looking at all the data. We have a little video that we're going to watch quickly, so Molly can go ahead with that. Videos are always fun to get going.
I did try it in advance, so I'm hoping it's going to work. And it is a little bit quiet. I apologize for that. So you might want to turn up your volume momentarily. It's just about a minute long.
They are fiber optic temperature cables, so we'll be taking temperature incrementally all the way down the street. So we'll do 2 on either side of the bank and 1 down the center. I think the idea is that we'll have 2 people on the spool. We'll have 2 people in the water for each spool setting. It's kind of, we haven't done this before, so we'll see how best to and how frequently we need to put rocks on it. We'll be trying to locate areas of groundwater upwelling, and then at those locations potentially use those, use that data to define and highlight areas for our habitat work. That's the theory.
Molly, we are not seeing the video. We're seeing the PowerPoint, the slide.
Oh, goodness. All right. Sorry. Let me try one more time. See if this works. Can you see it now?
Here we go.
Yes.
They are fiber optic temperature cables, so we'll be taking temperature incrementally all the way down the street. So we'll do 2 on either side of the bank and 1 down the center. I think the idea is that we'll have 2 people on the spool. We'll have 2 people in the water for each spool setting. It's kind of, we haven't done this before, so we'll see how best to and how frequently we need to put rocks on it. We'll be trying to locate areas of groundwater upwelling, and then at those locations potentially use that data to define and highlight areas for our habitat work. That's the theory.
Steve, are you ready for the next slide?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yep.
So these are just some photos of, again, kind of showing, what goes on. There's an awful lot of in-office testing that had to be conducted and configuration of this unit. So again, it's not user-friendly. If we have folks that know how to use it, which our new techs are very good at it, it's always good to show somebody how to do it. I had to spend a lot of time on the phones configuring this. On the bottom left-hand side, you can actually see where we're retrieving the DTS cable. Joanne Humphreys works for Trout Unlimited, works for Tracy. Her husband came up with this nifty design to reel it back in, it worked wonderful, and we thank him for his help. And then on the right-hand side, you can see basically the setup. We have two deep cycle batteries wired in parallel that are also supplied by a 100-watt solar panel. And then we've got the DTS and the optical switch inside this locked box. And we also had, one thing that we had a problem with is we weren't aware that we had to leave a computer at the site. And we were under the impression that we could use an SD card and just collect the data that way. Well, now when we have to run a laptop as well as the DTS system, the power supply is not necessarily going to be it's not going to be good enough for running all that. So I was kind of scampering at the last minute to figure out how to deal with this. Again, fortunately, we had the 2 TU techs down in the FUDR office, and they kept a good eye on it and kept swapping batteries out. I think next year we're going to have to come up with a better power supply than what we had this year. So that was definitely something that we learned this year that we're going to have to change for next year. Next slide, please. And this basically kind of gives you an idea. This is just a photo of my monitor on my computer, and I realize it's very hard to see, but what it does is it gives you a longitudinal cross-sectional profile of the stream once you install multiple cables. And again, this will show you throughout the cross-section of the stream for 500 meters where that groundwater upwelling may be, or if it's not there at all, which we found too. So it is what it is. If you find it, great. You're not always going to. And so again, we can basically use treatments like towwood structures and grade controls, boulder clusters, pool diggers, and try to put these treatments in these locations where this groundwater upwelling is. And again, not just throw them in some area where maybe it's too hot even for the fish. Maybe there's too much sun. Maybe they're not going to be there anyway. So it's a really neat tool that we're still learning. And next slide, please, Molly. I think that might be it for me. This is Caroline now. Thank you.
Is Caroline able to unmute herself? I know she's on here.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about the project I've spent the most time on, that being the East Branch Trout Habitat Improvement Project. The goal of this project was basically to understand the challenges that the trout face in the East Branch. We wanted to develop mitigation strategies, management activities, basically to reduce potential impacts and increase the wild and native trout populations. So we wanted to assess thermal impacts that were caused by the dam that you can see in the picture by deploying and monitoring temperature loggers at sites upstream and downstream of this dam. We wanted to develop and implement a fish tracking study to better understand how the fish move throughout the watershed and any potential challenges they face. And then also complete an initial review of road stream crossings. Next slide, Molly. So as Steve mentioned before, the RFIDs, or the radio frequency identification units, I'm just going to talk a little bit of what goes into installing them. So basically first, after we identify a site or a location we want to put the RFID in, we have to install the antenna. The antenna is speaker wire that we feed through PEX piping or some kind of piping to protect it, because it goes along the bottom of the stream and then loops back up across the stream, creating a loop. And we hook it into an auto tuner that eventually runs into the actual unit itself that is on the bank. This unit is run by two 12-volt batteries and charged by a solar panel. So basically, the fish have the tag that Steve had mentioned in them. The antenna picks that up as they swim through and sends it back to the unit that's on the stream bank. Next slide, please. A little bit about the pit tagging. So basically, we record the trout's weight, length, its species if we're in the wild, and then we also write down the tag number it's going to be receiving. First, we started at the Catskill Fish Hatchery, where we tagged the hatchery trout that were going to be stocked into the East Branch. I believe we waited about a day, and then the hatchery employees brought the fish out to be stocked at certain sites along the East Branch. To get our wild fish tagged, we went electrofishing at specific sites upstream and downstream of the dam. Basically, we set up a field station right along the stream where we were tagging. Pretty straightforward, same things. We had pit tags, the needles needed for it, measured them, weighed them, recorded all the information, and sent them on their way. Next slide, please. This is a graph that kind of shows the movement of the trout through our RFIDs. Basically, we saw the most movement downstream throughout the summer. They were basically moving to the tributaries, and that was the most movement that we saw. So, next slide. I wanted to touch on the temperature monitoring that was also going on. This was basically led by the members of the Ashokan Papacton watershed chapter. George, Peter, and Lenny, they installed them, retrieved them, and then George basically takes care of the data and sends it over to us. These temp loggers are deployed from July to September, and the data that I'm going to show you is just from 2016 to 19. Next slide, please. So I manipulated the data from the last couple years and compared them to the Hulkuttsville Dam temp logger. Just a quick overview. For the daily average, upstream temperatures were 3.4 degrees cooler than the dam, and downstream temperatures were overall 3.0 degrees cooler, leaving it at 0.4 degrees difference between upstream and downstream of the dam. The max, you see the daily max average upstream of the dam is about 3.1. Downstream of the dam was about 2.0 degrees difference than the temp right at the dam. The Batavia Kill, Bragg Hollow, and a golf course feeder, they were all tributaries. I felt it was important to see the difference in temperature there. The Batavia Kill was 3.7 degrees cooler. Its daily average was 3.7 degrees cooler. Bragg Hollow was 5.7 degrees cooler. And the golf course feeder that ran into the East Branch as well was 5.4 degrees cooler. Next slide, please. This is just a visual of the temperatures throughout July to the end of September. The orange represents downstream of the dam, and the green represents upstream. As you can see, upstream's still cooler than downstream. However, Batavia here, you can really see how much cooler it is compared to all the other locations here. The blue is Hubble. This is at Hubble Farm. It's an area that's very wide and shallow and doesn't have much coverage. So that's quite warm, you know, it warms up quite a bit as well. Next slide, please. So basically, I'm going to summarize all the data. The trout that were located downstream of the dam, they moved more frequently and further in October compared to upstream, which could indicate trout needed to travel farther to find suitable habitat to spawn. Trout moved more outside of the spawning season downstream of the dam, like I said, during the summer, which may indicate that trout need to move in order to find their cold water refuge. Trout move from the mainstream to the tributaries during the summer months. Batavia Kill we found to be a very important thermal refuge for trout in the summer. We would like to do some additional work there to concentrate on the Batavia and quantify and improve habitat. The dam is basically we have come to the conclusion that the dam is impacting trout movement and increasing the stream temperature downstream. The best way to mitigate these negative effects from the dam on the East Branch is to remove the dam and restore the river. However, the dam is privately owned and it's used to operate a kayak and birding destination resort. The landowner, Jim Kelly, has been fairly cooperative, and he's interested in maintaining and the impoundment above the dam. He is willing to look at alternative strategies to allow fish to move through there more freely. The spillway now, it's too fast, it's too high, it's still a barrier for trout trying to get up or downstream of the dam. Okay. And this is Tracy, I believe.
Thanks, Caroline. So throughout all of this presentation, really the idea of fish movement and how important that is in the Upper Delaware River is clear. And one of the other studies that we are working on is really assessing road stream crossings and the potential impacts to trout and habitat fragmentation. And so we have had a team of 2 out in the towns of Colchester, Deposit, and Hancock doing road stream crossing. Really is an assessment using protocol that is standardized, and they are taking measurements of the structure, looking at the stream, looking at the road surface to identify the potential for a structure to be an aquatic passage barrier. And you can see from the map that if you're looking at all of the road stream crossings in the Upper Delaware in those 3 towns I mentioned, that a majority of those crossings are on trout streams. And so the importance of understanding how the road infrastructure is impacting trout movement is kind of critical to our work. And so the results so far on the team of 2, they've been out there all summer long, and they've assessed 486 of the 541 crossings that we've identified. And you can see the pie graph that really shows you the impact or the significance of the barrier. And so if you're looking at that pie graph, the severe or significant, those are what we would consider barriers, and those really are our focus for replacements. And so the next step after we have this data will really be trying to understand, obviously, the aquatic passage score. We also will run that data through a hydraulic model so we understand flooding And then we will work closely with the towns to help develop a road stream crossing management plan for each town and determine which priorities should move forward to replacement. And then we'll help them with the design and hopefully fundraising to be able to get those barriers removed. Molly, I think you can forward. So that is the end of our presentation. And this is a good time for any kind of questions.
I think, Grant, you're going to facilitate the questions?
Yeah.
Is that right?
So we have one from Dan Plummer. It says, "Hi Caroline. In the East Branch area you were referencing, do you know how many wild trout are in those sections, or is it primarily a stocked fishery?"
I think Steve or Tracy could probably answer that better.
Yeah, so as far as the study goes, Dan, we were able to tag both wild and stocked trout. That number was, let's see. So for the total tagged, we had a majority were brown trout, but we also had brook trout, which were important to understanding their movement as well. And wild versus hatchery, we had around 600 wild trout and 1,000 of the stocked trout.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we do have a lot of great questions. However, we do have to move on to our next presentation. But we would like to thank everyone who also answered or who also asked questions.